Hi, this is Ron Gilbert, and you're listening to the Scene World Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm AJ. Joerg is over there, and that means this is Studying Naked Mole Rats with AJ and Joerg.
Nice. Yes. So,
it's really the Scene World Podcast.
It is really, yes. So, news. Well, for once,
just jump right into it. Why don't we? In a minute, we're going to be talking with Chris Abbott about Project Hubbard.
Yeah, right.
Which is going on right now. Currently, they are fundraising. This will be going on through October and should be ending in November, correct?
November the 5th.
So this one's a time-sensitive one, so everyone should check that out when they're done listening to this and donate and contribute to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, before we talk to Chris Abbott, though, there's potentially some news that we have.
Yes. Okay. I was a quick starter today. Yeah, so Chris Wilkins, all about Chris, this podcast, released a new Kickstarter about a new Oliver Twins game.
Okay.
And it's again a Disney game, and it's called Mystery World Dizzy, a new old game by the Oliver Twins. And this time it will be PAL NTSC multi-region, because the first time I was actually a beta tester and it only worked correctly on NTSC, and it would crash on PAL NESs.
Wow, that's different. Usually it's the other way around.
Nobody really understood why a British developer duo would make an NTSC game. But who knows what happened in the 90s?
The 90s were a crazy time.
Yeah, right. When you had Rob Hubbard, just to mention it again, working for Electronic Arts, making PAL tunes and having it NTSC fixed. Or, for example, Activision making a PAL release, which was Power Drift. The only PAL release Activision ever did was Power Drift in Europe. Nobody really understood why they made a European game, you know. Yeah. But hey, that were the times, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's not actually the only game that crashes. For example, World Games, the NTSC version for the C64, crashes on PAL C64 because the timing is so critical. Another game that crashes is Rocket Ranger for the NES, the NTSC version, crashes on PAL machines too. So it's not so uncommon that PAL games crash on NTSC or NTSC games crash on PAL. It didn't happen all the time, but sometimes very graphic intensive games especially would crash because the timing was so critical to the 50, 60 hertz.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, what's your opinion about Sam's Journey being NTSC fixed and to make up for that timing issue using a ROI? Is that a downer for you or
not at all? I'm all for that. It's a good solution, I guess. I have an RU, so I've pre-ordered Sam's Journey, so yeah, so I'm looking forward to playing that. And it's cool that they would. I mean, there's so many different solutions now for RUs available. It's nice to be able to use them for something, I think.
Yeah, I remember a few podcasts back you said you aren't a fan of the RAM expansion unit. That's the full name. But, well, nowadays it's getting more use.
I am a fan of it. What I'm not a fan of is I have the AproSpen. It's the multi-cartridge thing that supposedly lets you use certain cartridges with other cartridges. And the RAM expansion is one of those things they say that will work with certain other things. And the idea is that I would like to have that and my fast load working, which doesn't work most of the time. And aside from that is the fact that you've got this giant thing sticking straight up and it's getting in the way of the screen. So you can't, it's not elegant, but I don't have a problem with the expansion itself.
I have the RAM expansion unit, but the CMD model, which is actually smaller, but using the same parts like the Commodore one.
Right. Yeah, it also doesn't have. I don't think it uses as much power. Like this one, I had to get the heavy duty power supply for the 64.
Yeah, the HiPod tested ones. Yeah. Yeah, actually, the last one was Dreamworld Pogi, also by the Oliver twins. At least a game that is not Dizzy. All right. So you think it's not bad? Yeah. I think it's really cool, and I said that a lot of times that games are officially NTSC fixed, so it's opening the market to America.
Yeah,
that's something we started with Scene World, by the way. Ooh, yeah. Other news?
Well, there's the Pro Division game competition is going on. There's currently 14 participants. There's only a few days left. You can register up until October 31st to join the competition. Wow. So you can register. There's 3 different ways, or actually a couple of different ways. You can post on a thread at Lemon64. You can post in the thread on Forum64. You can mail send an email to competition@prodivision.games, or you can go to the forum in the Pro Division page, and we will link to all these in the description below. But that's an interesting ongoing thing that's happening right now that, if you want to get into it, you can get into it.
Great. Definitely something to get into it.
Yeah.
Well, another news is there will soon be some racing game for the 64 multi-platform, and Andrew Fisher, our very own Andrew Fisher, did the music for that one.
Really?
Yeah. It's called 8-Bit Slicks.
Well, I didn't know Andrew did the music for that. How that's pretty good.
Yeah, I figured that out when he was retweeting our C64 TV tweet.
Cool.
And saying, "Here's the game I made the music for."
Yeah, this is a top-down racing game. It's a remake of a game that existed in the past, but it's going to be networked, so you can play it online with friends across platforms, because there's going to be there's supposed to be an Apple version, Apple II version, and an Atari version, and all these different 8-bit machines will be able to play this game.
So will we do a Twitch live stream again?
Absolutely.
We should invite the developer of that game and Andrew as a music guy.
Yeah.
So just to mention that we made a similar Twitch show, and we will link to that in the podcast description, because we made a record on YouTube, and it was like 3 hours talking about net games on the C64. I even didn't know that you can talk so long about such a topic, but it was very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we were backed by Bill Hurt from Commodore, who made promo for it.
Yeah.
Totally surprised about that, but hey, it's great. Yeah, so that's good to know that there's not only one developer, but now more than one developer.
There's
working
a lot
on
of stuff
games
getting developed right now for the 64. It's actually really,
like I always say, for so many Kickstarters and hardware, I need a second job to buy it all.
Yeah, really.
So, when you are in a job interview, so why do you want to work for us as a second job? Because there's so much C64 and retro stuff on Kickstarter and on eBay and all those other places. I need more money.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, I don't have any more. Do you have any more news?
Good question. Oh yes, Doom is actually being ported to the Switch.
Oh really?
And it's going to be released on Switch on November the 10th.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So in roughly 4 weeks.
Nice.
It's pretty interesting because we got the feedback after our Sega podcast that a lot of Switch games are bad and have a sluggish frame rate or bad graphics. For example, FIFA Soccer on Switch is using the Xbox 360 engine, and people are disappointed by that. But I think it's not the developer's fault. It's just that the console is not very powerful, you know.
Right.
And Sonic Mania is also sluggish. People told me. So yeah, well, we will see.
Yeah.
We will see. I don't have a Switch, and I'm not planning to get one this year. Maybe next year.
I don't have one either, but I know some people that do, so maybe I'll borrow it.
Yeah, playing some Doom. Yeah. So anyway, nowadays developers are slowly adapting to Switch, which is funny because if you watched our YouTube videos with interviews on Gamescom this year, most developers said, no, we are not planning to release for Switch this year.
Yeah.
So the majority of good titles and the majority of developing studios is waiting till next year till they figured out a way to make games looking better and performing better. Yeah. So I don't know if Nintendo made a good move in releasing yet another not so comparable console on the performance side.
Well, it takes a little bit of time to get people used to it and to get the specs and whatnot out there so that developers know what they can do with it. So, could just be a matter of time.
Do you think Nintendo should have gone for a stronger console? Because
Nintendo never has gone for strong consoles. All of Nintendo's consoles have been kind of a little bit behind.
Yeah, except the SNES, which was better on the tech space. Tech specs compared to the Genesis or Mega Drive in Europe. Despite as we learned in the Sega interview, despite Sega had blast processing.
Yes, the blast processing.
Yeah. So you don't think it's a downer that Switch?
Not necessarily. No, if the games are made well, then it's a good game. It doesn't require the best hardware in order to be a good game, as we've seen. You know, we're still playing.
What's your opinion about the move from EA to use Xbox 360 engine on FIFA Soccer?
I don't know. What's going on?
Should they have waited till the next year, like Konami?
Potentially, yeah.
That's a pretty short news section then.
Yeah, well, it's still 15 minutes.
You want to go?
So we are talking to Chris Abbott. He is a musician, and he is the main guy behind Project Hubbard, which is coming out, which will be starting on October 5th, which will have already started by the time that everyone hears this, but it's going on now.
Yeah, you are mainly known for doing Z64 audio.
Yes, and being the looking after the composers' tunes, being a publisher for them.
You also work together with others like Matt Cray, right?
Yes, yeah. I helped him out with his with getting started with his Kickstarter Reformation, and lots of other stuff as well. I generally act as a resource for other composers.
How did that actually start? That you created Z64 Audio and started publishing for composers?
I asked. In 1994, I started. I got a sound card and I started doing MIDI files of Commodore 64 tunes and putting them on CompuServe and AOL. People liked them. People were saying, "Wouldn't it be great to have a CD of this stuff?" And at the time, there were people who were saying, "Yes, I'm going to go into the studio and do a CD of this stuff," but no one did. No one had done it. No one was going to do it. So I did. I emailed all the Rob Hubbards on CompuServe. When you could do that kind of thing on the internet. And he wrote back, including a few other Rob Hubbards who were very puzzled. And we got talking from there, and eventually contributed to the first CD. I sent him some stuff, and he said, "You've kind of missed the point there," and then got in a sequencer and did some programming and did some playing and came up with something much better. and that went on to Back in Time 1. A few years later, it became sensible to, because I'd done a lot of legal legwork for Back in Time, so it made sense to go to the composers and say, look, there's people coming and trying to cover this stuff, and I know the copyright mechanisms. I know how the money flows in the back end when people release a CD of something. So I can help you out with that, because otherwise it's just floating around and people will rip you off. And if I didn't do it, someone else was probably going to. Someone who was a bit more exploitative.
I see. Interesting.
Won't mention any names on that one.
Oh, I didn't have any names in mind. It's just that there's a vacuum. When there's a vacuum and there's potential money in it, someone will get sucked in. Mm-hmm. And so I'm basically there to stop that happening. I make sure we lose all the money, so there's no money, so no one's interested.
So you are the good guy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. There's been things like Zombie Nation and whatever where I wasn't allowed to do what I was supposed to be doing, and as a result, he ran off with a piece of Commodore 64 music and never gave it back. That's still annoying. Okay. But he had the lawyers, and poor old Dave Whittaker didn't.
I see. And how did your involvement in computers started? Was it like the typical story, being a kid playing computer games?
Being a kid, not being allowed to play computer games at the start because it was at school, and they were Commodore pets, and you weren't allowed to play computer games on them. You had to create your own games and do serious things like learn machine code. But we still played games, but only when the teacher was out of the room.
And you had to make them first.
Sometimes, yeah. We didn't have a cassette deck. No, there was a one disk drive, and you had a bit of plastic pipe that you had to put on top of your computer to signify that you were actually the person using the disk drive. It's called the flag.
Nice.
Okay, interesting. Weird. So and from there, as you said, in the early 90s, you thought you are doing publishing of remixes and music and so on. You mentioned MIDI, which is interesting because most people think MIDI sucks pretty much.
It depends how you program it. It'll never sound as good as a series of expensive synthesizers put through a mixer, but you can get some good results out of it. The AWE and the Yamaha XG both had pretty good facilities, and if you captured the vibrato and captured the essence of the piece in terms of the way it was performed, then it was possible to make it sound similar to the SID, but also to expand it with instruments. Of course, it sounds quite basic now, but it went down pretty well at the time because there's nothing to compare it with. There was VGmusic.com, and most of the MIDI files on that were fairly terrible. These ones at least had that essence of SID, which is pretty important, unless you're going into a completely different style. There has to be some style somewhere, whether it's the style of the SID or whether you're taking it into big band or whether you're making it orchestral. But there has to be something as opposed to nothing. And the MIDI files were something because they reminded people of the tunes and they could play them on the stuff they had, because SID players weren't there were some, but they weren't advanced and they weren't particularly common, and the internet wasn't the internet-ish. I mean, it was, but right. HVSC didn't exist yet. It was still what was the name of of what HVSC was before that?
Oh,
so
yeah, I can't think of it. I know what you're talking about though, because I remember that.
And then there was the top 100 SIDs on the Amiga, and that was the closest people were coming to good emulation. So there was a kind of there wasn't the assurance that the SIDs will be remembered by history or be able to be played by future generations, because no one saw this future coming. So the MIDI files were kind of an attempt to nail things down in history and keep things alive. The CD was pretty much the same deal. It was to get Rob Hubbard onto CD, create some tracks which represented the originals in a more physical form.
Oh, Rob Hubbard took part in a lot of projects. For example, the Run 10 album that was actually done with an orchestra in the Netherlands.
Indeed, yes, the C64 Orchestra. The Riacotti Ensemble, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Together with Jeroen Tel.
Yes, yeah, we're putting some of the sheet music from that, some of the arrangements into the Project Hubbard book at the back as a kind of bonus, which is nice. There was a real problem when a few years later, because their second disc had SIDS on it, and their record company claimed the SIDS at YouTube, which meant suddenly that all the videos with SIDS in them that were on that CD was suddenly paying money to the C64 Orchestra people.
Wow. Okay.
Which is a real problem with Content ID sometimes.
Wow. Well, I didn't know that. I just noticed that I wrote to the organizer of this orchestra and said, hey, why don't you come play in our city? And then they never replied. And then I got an email from the former organizer, and he told me, like, yeah, the new organizer of the orchestra, he puts all these Z64 stuff down. So, and this is how it unfortunately ended.
It can happen. It can happen, but there's nothing to stop anyone putting together a new ensemble. I mean, it's just regular orchestral players. I mean, we're going to use the London Symphony Orchestra for our Commodore 64s. Commodore 64 stuff, and they're fine with it because they've already played Zelda, they already play Final Fantasy, they already do video game scoring for top games. Commodore 64 music, playing Thing on the String and William Wobbler together and calling it Thing Wobbler. It's all. I must admit, I'm amused at making the London Symphony Orchestra play a Commodore 64 tune called Thing Wobbler. It appeals to me, and appeals to Ben and Rob, I think, as well.
Yeah, you're not the only one who did that. I mean, we spoke earlier to Dave Lowe, who also did the same thing, and I think he even used a similar orchestra. So similar, yes. He did that at Abbey Road. It was I think there was about 50 players in the end. We'd be going for nearer 70 for the Barbican. So 20 more. Okay.
It makes all the difference, especially if they're all drummers.
Exactly. Yes.
Funny. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a thing nowadays that a lot of composers are doing that with orchestra. So it's like
well, I think that a lot of them, this is when they compose, this is sort of how they hear it in their heads, and then they're limited to 3 voices on a SID, and it comes out being a good song, but still, when they originally envision it, it has this big orchestral backing and whatnot to it.
Very definitely true, yes.
Especially Rob Hubbard released some of his synthesizer original versions that were used to size it down to SID music. So the original version of Formula 1 really sounds a lot more dynamic and has a lot more voice to it, because a synthesizer can do a bit more than a C64, even back in the day. Yeah. So I know what you're talking about here.
Well, we've taken that idea and we've really run with it in Project Hubbard, because what we've done is imagine that he'd done more of those tracks, but he'd done them with lots more expensive equipment in a proper studio for a proper album. So the concept is, let's say Rob Hubbard was an electronic music star in 1980, and he released an album called Hubbard 80, and most of the SIDs, or 15 of the SIDs, for instance, were covers from that album. And that's what we're doing is creating the imaginary album that those came from, using no technology that existed existed after 1980, after the end of 1979. So luckily, Marcel, who's working with Rob on this, has access to the Vintage Synths Museum in the Netherlands, so we can get access to some pretty rare things like the Korg PS3200, which is a monster thing. Huge. They only made 200 of it.
That's amazing. And how does it feel for you to work together with all those music legends?
It's always an honor, because they're such great musicians and great people as well. I was just a normal fan who decided to step up and start doing shit, and this is where we end up. It's quite astonishing, really.
Surprisingly, a lot of those composers are even surprised that anybody is interested in hearing their stories and re-releasing the music in a way, you know.
They are. Rob Hubbard, when I was trying to sell Rob Hubbard on the idea of the book, and the Kickstarter also has a book in it, and he wrote back to me saying, "I'm not sure anyone would buy that. I haven't done anything." And I was like, Rob. And the same thing came up in his Bedroom to Billions interview. He was like, I've done nothing special. And because to him it was all stuff he did for a living years ago, and he still has a problem acknowledging to himself that it touched so many lives. But what we did was that we made the book into 4 sections. So there's only a quarter of it was biographical, and even that is not like, okay, what did Rob do? What did Rob eat for breakfast on the 3rd of November 1953? Okay. There's nothing of that. It's some biographical stuff to fill in the timeline. Then a great musicologist to actually analyze the music and work out why it worked, to actually give it some serious analysis, because chip music has suffered from not being taken seriously, like that orchestra guy that you were talking about, who's now running that ensemble. It's easy to say chip music, it's not music, but it is. And it's very pure music, and it's almost proto-sketch music that people can, when they listen to it, they almost... If a regular piece of music is like a glitter ball, piece of chip music is like a bit of silly putty. And the brain, when it gets the silly putty, can mold it into whatever experience it wants. It can add its own memories to it. It can add its own interpretation. With the glitter ball, you're pretty much stuck with what you've got. So chip music tunes are experienced differently by different people, because they attach their memories, they attach their feelings,
exactly,
and they attach what they hear in their head when they're hearing it. Because the brain loves to complete things, and SIDS are essentially incomplete.
And Rob Hubbard did a lot of other stuff too that many people don't know. For example, he even did like music for Ski or Die or Skate or Die, even on the PC in Adlib. Yes. And for PC Speaker. And he really managed to make the PC Speaker sound for some games really very good, you know.
Well, that's the archive bit of Project Hubbard, which is where we collect all this stuff that people haven't heard, all the recordings from old PC, Genesis, Mega Drive, NES stuff, and collect that together and turn some of it into SIDS.
Great.
Because that's what he was doing at the time. If you've got stuff he did in the 1980s, which is great music done when he was a real synth guy, synth jazz. He's more of an orchestral guy these days, but still with the jazz, but much more academically minded in terms of music theory. So you've got Rob Hubbard sounds and you've got Rob Hubbard tunes, and all that was needed was the person to put them together. And so Jason Page of Graph Gold has been doing some sterling work in SID Tracker 64, and we'll start using Rob's EA driver, which we've got the source code of, so to do 2 samples, 3 voices, and do a developer diary of what it's like to implement a Rob Hubbard tune in a Rob Hubbard driver in 2017, which should be fascinating to read. The book also has a section on the technology where it explains the waveforms, the shape of the sounds he used, looks at driver differences between games, and then there's a whole section devoted to the fans and cultural impact as well, because what defines Rob is his impact on other people. I mean, to him, it was just stuff he did, but he had a huge impact on people around him, the people he worked with, the fans, the journalists. And to an extent, the story of Rob Hubbard is more the story of how people reacted to Rob Hubbard than actually the story of what Rob Hubbard did.
Yeah, just reminds me when we interviewed Saul Cross, who is also in C64 games. He said during the interview he heard Sing of a Spring 4 weeks before release because he was working in the same building as Rob Hubbard.
Oh, excellent!
and we didn't know that he was actually active back in the days. We found that out during the interview. So I can totally understand what you're talking about.
And the funny thing about that is that Saul Cross did the music for the game My Life, which we've changed to Rob's Life for the Kickstarter, and now it has Rob Hubbard title music. So Rob Hubbard has taken over Saul Cross for the title tune and the loading tune, but the in-game tunes are still his. So
yeah,
so far, until we work out how to remove them.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally great. I mean, as I said, people are not always credited for everything they have done, and sometimes you are surprised. Like, I didn't know that he did the music for that, So I can totally understand, because if you talk to people and you talk about ad-lib music, most people would probably say Bobby Prince, who did, the Duke Nukem 2 music.
Yes.
And Commander Keen and all that stuff. And nobody would say, oh, Rob Hubbard. Rob Hubbard is more connected to SID music. Even though he did a lot more than this SID music. That's true.
I think people stopped paying attention after the SID because they went into other places, and he didn't do quite as much, and when it did appear it wasn't in games they probably would have played. He was still doing good stuff though. I mean, the stuff he did for instance, Sherlock on the PC in about 96, I think, was excellent. There's a load of stuff he did for that was beautiful. Hopefully some of that will be played by the London Symphony Orchestra if we get Robbie's concert. So that would be great.
I'm really happy to hear that you're not only concentrating on one part, which is the SID part, but also on the other parts that is concerning Rob Hubbard.
I think Rob was quite keen on that. One of the attractions for doing the Kickstarter for him, or for getting involved in it, because he's not doing it as such, but he's in it. And he's with it, but he's not running it. But anyway, the attraction was that there's a lot. People do only ever talk about that 3 or 4 years he was doing SID. And he's done an awful lot of stuff. He's done jazz stuff for a glass blowing thing. He's done a music box thing, a couple of music for Nokia games that were never released, as well as the EA stuff. Recently, he's and other orchestral cues, and played in jazz bands and played in cover bands, and there's quite a rich texture of a life in music, and stretching back to before SIDS, to the time of the War and Chimera and Formula One recordings that you mentioned. So mostly, even when he did he did a work opera. There was a TV program in the Northeast where they got him and a chap called Steve Daggett, who used to be in Lindisfarne, I think, a famous group, Lindisfarne, or is now. Lindisfarne? Who did Fog on the Tyne?
I don't know.
I think it was Lindisfarne. Anyway, so him and Rob did the music and Steve Daggett did the words for essentially a half-hour TV program about work and being unemployed in the British social security system, which was broadcast on television in a regional in Newcastle and around the surrounding area. And Rob was almost played that music live. It was run off sequences, but he was running around the studio as they were recording it, tweaking knobs and just making everything go. So if you imagine Rob running around much younger, sort of like a blue-ass fly, trying to keep this thing going, while Steve Daggett was being cheeky in the middle, singing about being unemployed and how nice it was to take money from the state. And but we've got that opera, and one of the tunes in it, two of the tunes will probably, one of the tunes is already a SID called Task Force, and it sounds just like a Lost Dragon's Lair 2 piece. It's amazing. And another one was called Life of Riley, which hasn't been done yet, but is Rob's favourite piece from that. So Much of what we're doing is is trying to give Rob, first of all, to give people the full Rob, not just the partial Rob, because his music, he's an amazing musician and he's done such a lot of stuff, and to make him happy, really.
Yeah, a lot of times you get, there's you'll know about a specific musician, you'll know the name, you'll know the music, but you don't really know who the person is behind it. You don't understand where they came from, what they're that kind of personal stuff that you can find out from a project like this.
Yes, yeah. I think much of the information that Rob can get very talkative when he does interviews for documentaries. So we've got a couple of extended interviews where he's interviewed for a documentary, and most of that will be left on the cutting room floor in the final documentary, but we've got access to the unedited interview, which gives us a lot of biographical material to work with and leads to follow up. And then we can find the people he worked with, the guy he recorded Sanction with for Zap 64, Steve Daggett, who he did all that stuff with, a guy's a TA who he worked with, because people, I think, remember people who work with Rob remember a lot more about his career than he does, because can you remember what you were doing for breakfast last week or last year? But the people who came across Rob, it tends to be a memorable thing, because he did memorable things, but only memorable to other people.
So the project includes the book, which is biographical, but also has more informative stuff and music and whatnot.
It's about 25% biography and 75% looking at his work and the people. I think that's about right for Rob. He's a modest guy, and it's not going to be a tell-all book. We're not going to. If he had a depression in 1983, we don't particularly care. Unless it caused him to do something particularly musically noteworthy, but even then we'd gloss over it. It's to throw his music into some kind of context and throw some light on where it came from and how he did it, rather than delving into the personal details of Rob. Because even if you did that, I think that the fans wouldn't. That the fans want to know things related to the music and relevant stuff, and also to fill in, to have a sense of the timeline, how he developed over time. And that's what we're going for, really.
And you mentioned interview material that you will use for that, but I guess there will be no videos or audio recordings from those interviews, I guess.
No, there are. We're going to be allowed to use two of them for, as far as I know, two of them for as downloadable videos for people, backers of the deluxe version.
Great.
It's one of them is from the Button Bashers movie, which is a nice kind of fun docudrama about the cultural things going on at the time. They actually do recreations of things like playground fights about ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64, and they had 1,000 people apply to be Rob Hubbard. And then Rob Hubbard said, "No, you're not having anyone appearing as me in that movie." So they had to send him away again. Interestingly, Ben Daglish, the part of Ben Daglish, might well be played by a relative of Ben Daglish. So let's see, shall we?
Great.
So, and then you've got the Hubbard 80, the studio album, which will be.
And that's the one where we've got a fixed list of modular synthesizers that were around at the time. Rob always loved his gear, so for him and Marcel working with these very powerful but a limited set of synthesizers to create the tunes from which the SIDs came from was quite an attractive idea. It's very difficult being a composer and then having to do the definitive remixes of your own work, especially when there are thousands of the damn things, and a lot of people have put a lot of passion into them.
Right. And
some of them are some of the remixes are unbeatable in the particular style they chose to do. But the one place that the composer can go that no one else can is backwards, and that's where we went. And so it's called actually a premix album.
There will also be unreleased stuff. What kind of... Is it unreleased music that he's done?
Yes, he did. When he was doing things like War and Chimera and Formula One Simulator, he was also doing a lot of other tunes that never actually made it to SIDS. Some of those are now making it to SID, but we're putting the actual version he did on the original equipment into the archive set, so people can hear both versions. In some cases, there's orchestrations that he did with limited equipment, which are now being brought into proper orchestral sample libraries, such as the Nokia games, such as the Sherlock games, and a fair amount of, I think, unreleased stuff from the EA years, stuff that never got put out, that we have managed to rescue from Voyager Sequencer. But that was targeting an MT32, so there's I'm not entirely sure what we've got yet, but we've got well enough material for a double album of unreleased and rare Rob Hubbard stuff, which SID fans won't have heard.
And the project information also says that there's new SIDs by Rob Hubbard. And is he actually doing them himself, or is this like taking his information and someone else is putting it to the SID?
Yeah, it's combining Rob Hubbard's music with Rob Hubbard's sounds. So for instance, we make the decision, okay, this sounds a bit like a Dragon's Lair tune, so we'll target the Dragon's Lair 2 driver, and then Jason Page is doing it with look at the limitations of that and honor those limitations and those sounds, and then pull the Rob Hubbard tune from the 80s into a SID form. And what you've got is essentially a SID that's as good as anything he ever released. Present Rob can't do that, but past Rob left us a treasure trove. Okay. It's like Michael Jackson being a hologram, I guess. But we're utilising past Rob very heavily, even though present Rob isn't able to help that much, apart from to approve the work and to generate ideas and stuff. He'll be with Hubbard 80. He's working with Marcel quite closely, and with the orchestra. But his heart is in orchestrations. So when it comes to the Rob Hubbard concert, you can bet he'll be in there, getting his hands dirty with the LSO.
Well, by interviewing all those composers, as I did a lot in the past, not only for the podcast but also for our YouTube channel, I've noted that there is a wide range of views regarding composers. For example, when we spoke to Dave Lowe, he said, like, of course I'm using the original code. Of course I'm using an original Amiga. Of course I still know how to code this stuff, you know? I didn't look at the stuff for 17 years, but of course I digged into it again. So even though he forgot a lot, he spent a year of digging into it again, you know, relearning, as Jeroen Tel said it once when we interviewed him. So I guess it all depends a bit, not only on how much you forgot, but also how you approach the project. If you say, I want to make the hands dirty myself, or if you say, I want to do it with other people who help me.
Well, yes, and Jar has producers now as well. He doesn't just do all the normal twiddling himself. But yes, Matt Gray got his hands dirty with SID when he was doing the new SIDs for Reformation. I mean, he felt a bit nervous about that, but he got down to it. Rob never really. It stressed him out even thinking about it.
Oh, okay.
So because it was such a kind of big roadblock that the Rob that sat there like a master in the 80s in the room. That Rob is now Dr. Rob Hubbard, music theory expert, jazz person, and orchestrator.
I see.
That the brain is completely different between those two things.
I see. Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you know, if it would have been nice if Rob would have sat down with a compiler and a Commodore 64. But I think people from the results we're getting from marrying old Rob with old Rob sounds, I think no one's going to be disappointed in the. Especially since the stuff that he was composing in the mid-80s is mid-80s Rob brain. The stuff he'd do now would come out completely musically different. And his ideas would be so big that it would be very frustrating to put them down into three voices.
Ah, I see. Yeah, that's another problem. You mentioned the high voltage SID collection at the beginning of the interview. So, despite you are releasing now unreleased SID tunes, as you said, especially from the EA years, will you still supply them after the Kickstarter to the high voltage SID collection?
They will make the collection after a suitable amount of time so that Kickstarter backers don't feel ripped off. It's important that they're there for history. But equally, I think people are buying, they're supporting Rob. They're giving him money. They're giving, the campaign money to do all these weird and wonderful things. But they deserve a bit of exclusivity on these things until for a while, and a good while. But history won't lose these things. That's very important.
Because I'm asking this, as we all know, there has been some problems in this area, like, it's my stuff, while others said it should be made available for free to the community, So it's a good attitude you have. So you say Kickstarters are getting it exclusively, but in the long run, it will be in the archive for preserving.
Yes, I mean within 2 years, definitely, possibly a little bit sooner, but hopefully people will love them and the project so much that they will buy into it early, so they can hear them early, and hear them as they develop and support that. But you don't want them disappearing into a project and then the project just stops and then those things have vanished forever. That's a bad thing for history. The whole thing is the book is about preserving Rob's history.
Yeah.
It will be a bit funny to then create new bits of history of Rob Hubbard and then hide them or not make them available.
Of course, yeah. Well, I understand you're totally getting my point, because there is nothing that disturbs me more than having an archive, but not everything is in it, because some people are against it. Like, why? It's an archive. An archive means an archive,
I know, right? I mean, I've been part of the HVSC team for many years.
Okay. I didn't know that. Okay, so
I was there pretty much at the beginning.
Oh,
and my job is to advise on possible legal stuff, because if you're protecting yourself against legal stuff, then you need someone with at least a little bit of vague knowledge about that inside the tent. And that's kind of what I've been doing, because there are some people in the scene who say, oh, right, copyright, it's bad, people who know copyright are bad, but there's a lot of predators out there preying on composers and preying on people. And it's at least a little helpful if there's someone inside the tent to try and fend them off or to stick up for them.
There is a lot of predatory stuff. I mean, as a guy that understands the legal ramifications of this, we can look back to a few years back when, mainstream music was sampling C64 songs.
You mean Timberlake?
Yeah, no, Timberland, not Timberlake.
Oh, Timberland, yeah, Timberland.
Timberland and Zombie Nation.
Right.
Yes.
Right, and they're sampling the SIDs and putting it, or they say they're sampling the SIDs, but when you listen to it, it's just the whole SID. They just stuck it in there.
Yeah, and then they had the problem. Then they were in legal trouble with GRG, Glenroom Galafoss.
Yeah, well, they tried. I don't know if that's still. Did they settle that?
I actually flew to Finland to give evidence at a court case in Helsinki in Christmas 2008 to defending GRG. That didn't work out very well. Not because I was terrible, but although I probably was, but because the judges don't get chip music, and they often don't get copyright law either, and this one certainly didn't. But the case ended when it went to America, and they were suing Universal, and the court turned around and said, "There's no case to answer because that recording of that SID was never registered at the U.S. Copyright Office." Now, if he'd have been the composer as well, then that would have gone very differently. But Timberland's lot was smart because they bought off the composer right at the beginning. They bought him off and put a gag order on him. so he couldn't testify.
Oh.
So GRG was unfortunately in the position of having to sue just on the sound, and that's a lot more difficult. And as we saw, as soon as it got to America, the Americans were like, "Oh, it's not in our system. It doesn't count. It's not copyrighted," and so the case died, which is very unfortunate. But the Zombie Nation case was interesting because that involved Zombie Nation getting Dave Whitaker to sign a transfer of ownership when Dave thought he was signing a waiver. So Dave thought he was getting the money for everything being as normal. The guy had ripped off the SID, got caught, was about to sign a contract with the Ministry of Sound, and no one knew about it, and except him, obviously. And but the contract he made Dave sign to get some actual money gave him lock, stock, and barrel ownership of the SID. There was no jurisdiction in the contract. It was like 2 paragraphs. No moral rights to get actually credited for having written it. I mean, wow. Zombie Nation does not even, according to that contract. Well, Dave didn't waive his moral rights, so technically, every time Zombie Nation claims to have written that, he's infringing Dave's rights morally, but no one really cares about that in the legal system. So, wow. There was an attempt to get it back in 2009 with the producer behind the Crazy Frog album, because they wanted to do a Crazy Frog ringtone of Lazy Jones.
Yeah, from Jamba, which is in the UK called Jamster.
It would have been released through them. This was this was the record label behind the Crazy Frog album and the ringtone. And it went to court in Germany, and that was the worst judgment ever written in copyright, I think. One of the arguments was that because Michael Jackson ripped off Carl Orff, this was not a case that had to be answered. And then after that, the only solution was taking legal action in America. But that's like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the statute of limitations had expired. So, wow. So that died too. Although there is another attempt to get it back, ongoing. Now Zombie Nation has less money for lawyers. Let's see how that goes.
I mean, music is always a very, very very difficult thing.
I just try, if I do make music, I just try to make it sound terrible enough that no one will ever want to steal it.
There's a lot of Kickstarters follow the same approach.
Gosh, yeah. You see, all this music law and copyright and all that stuff, we could fill hours with that topic.
So back to the Kickstarter. There's also a game cartridge, Rob's Life cartridge.
Yeah, absolutely. There was an original game called My Life, and I went to Trevor Story, the graphic artist who's done artwork for Project Sizology and a lot of other stuff, brilliant artist, and suggested that it'd be good to have a game that Rob Hubbard was the hero of. And the fact that it became Rob's Life seemed to chime very well with the fact that there was a biographical aspect to all of this. So the game is Rob's Life, and the Kickstarter is Rob's Life. We've just put a new pledge level in where someone can pledge to be the end of game boss, and they get their face on the loading screen, and they get to replace Ben Daglish as the end of game boss, and they get their name in the scroller. But that's not for the cartridge. That's a customized disc version that person gets.
But I think it's probably a different game, because there was another composing game made by a composer, and that was To Be on Top by Chris Hülsbeck.
Yes. If you were writing a game from scratch about Rob Hubbard, then writing To Be on Top Rob Hubbard edition would probably be pretty much the game design you go with. But we didn't have that time, and it's a reasonably small part of the Kickstarter, so we went for a more light-hearted route. But that would have been a good game, trying to become a famous game composer in the 1980s. You could have some pretty good character names like Cark Mail.
Yeah, it's it's interesting. So as we spoke about the Rob Hubbard project, as I remember, the Kickstarter starts soon. Let's talk a bit about what other plans and projects you have, if there's anything you can talk about.
They're pretty much, all the plans are pretty much right there in the Kickstarter. The concepts, the books. There might be more composer books based on the same template as the Rob Hubbard one. There's a couple of composers who would justify and have enough to justify such a book, such as Tim Follin. His book would be, he's an interesting, very interesting person with an interesting creative history, fascinating composing style, very unique musical feel, and an interesting set of things he's done after he left the SID and after he left video game music composing. The problem will be tracking him down. We won't need to rely on first-hand witnesses again.
Well, there are other composers that I would like to read and hear more about. For example, Wally Baben, who did the Tetris music on the C64.
I think there'd be grounds for a book which combined a few biographies of composers such as Mark Cooksey and Fred Gray and even Martin. Because Martin's kind of retired into being energy efficient now. He's always talking about Teslas and very interested in ecology. Not so interested in SID, because it's all people ever want to talk to him about from our scene, and he's got a bit fed up of it over 30 years.
The 8580 uses less voltage, so just talk to him about that one.
Yeah. And Ben Daglish's book would probably fail the lawyer test because there'd be so many spicy anecdotes.
Right. So let me ask you, you said you made other projects too. Now let's take a bit aside the Rob Hubbard project. What is the project or the person you spoke to or any experience that you are the most proud of that you were involved with?
I'm proud of them all in different ways. I'm immensely proud of being able to work with Marcel on Project Sidology and kind of be an idea man for putting... He's already got plenty of ideas of his own, but to have been able to have an influence on such amazing music, he's a real musical force. And more personally, the new Symphony 64 stuff, the orchestrations I'm doing that should get played at the concerts, I'm very proud of those. I've had to learn orchestration pretty much from scratch with no academic background, and it's fun. It's frustrating though, but it's very rewarding. And then being able to be in a position to make it happen so it's played by a big orchestra doesn't really get much better than that.
And do you think, now that you are such a big name, that people have a higher expectation about the outcome and the quality of the products you release than for other Kickstarters or other people doing similar projects?
Well, I work with big teams, really. I gather people together and get them to work producing the stuff that they want to produce, that they're enthusiastic about and that's in their style, and that can't help but come out good. I mean, if you're asking Fast Loaders to do metal, you're asking Uncle and the Bacon to do big band, and you're asking Mark Knight to do a John Carpenter Rob Hubbard soundtrack that sounds like it came from a science fiction horror movie. They're all passion projects. The chip music guy who is Kenny McAlpine, who's doing the book, that's his passion project. He's wanted to do that forever. Matt Gray's Reformation, he's doing his favourite tracks now, and finding that a lot easier than doing his own tracks because he doesn't have a duty to be definitive. He can just have fun. So everyone working on all the projects, it's always been their particular dream that they're trying to make real, And when that happens and they're technically qualified, you just get quality out at the end. My job is just herding the cats.
Okay, I see. But you are very successful with it. I mean, people know if your name is behind it, this will be quality. You know?
I'd hope that they have some confidence, even though I feel I feel a little bit guilty that I had to take time off from Symphony 64 to do this, but it was a question of getting the concerts into the calendars, if we make that much target. But these things need to be booked so far in advance that we need to take the time off, get the things into the calendar, then get the tickets sold, and then everything comes out after that in the end. But most of the stuff in the Rob Project Hubbard Kickstarter is running in parallel.
And I guess as an audio guy, project guy, you are also looking around you. So, is there any other project you are interested in that you are not involved with?
There's a lot of good projects, but none that I would get involved with because I'm acutely aware of how little time I have already.
No. I mean, you as a customer, you as somebody, you know. Oh, I'm pledging for this.
Oh right, yes, the Thalamus Kickstarter for Hunter's Moon cartridge. That's
yes.
running. That's running at the moment. Andy Roberts, the guy behind that, is a very professional guy and takes it very seriously. And Martin Walker's on board and. Well worth the pledge.
Good answer. I pledge for that as well.
And if he does well, then Creatures 3 comes out. So.
Yes, I've read that too. Yes, of course. Is there any doubt that it won't come out? I'm pretty sure that thing will happen.
I think as long as he gets to where he needs to be with Hunter's Moon, and it looks like the Kickstarter's doing pretty well at the moment. It'll get there. He'll get funded, and
Definitely.
We'll see what happens.
Definitely.
And he really wants to do that stuff. So it's a question of he'll do it unless it becomes impossible.
You know, I mean, what we have learned a lot of times is sometimes even if the Kickstarter or Indiegogo or something isn't successful the first try it again. Doesn't hurt, you know.
It can work that way. It depends if it was it depends what was wrong with it in the first place.
Well, how much for Project Hubbard? What is the goal for
50,000
for that going to be?
Pounds, I guess.
£50,000. Yes, the stretch goals, the main stretch goals for the orchestras are 150,000 and 200,000. But this is basically two Kickstarters in one because it's the book and the albums. Normally that would be two Kickstarters, but I couldn't do two Kickstarters. People would get annoyed, so pile it all into the one and then hope. But feedback seems to be that it might do okay and get there.
And as I mentioned before, hopefully if it doesn't get successful in the first try, you try again.
Hopefully we don't have to worry about
you
that.
said
And
the same thing when I said the same thing to Dave Lowe.
and where can people go to find out information about it and to pledge?
ProjectHubbard.com. And also there's a blog on c64audio.com which is covering various bits of it in more detail for people who want to know. There's some interesting stuff about how you create new SIDs for a composer who can't compose SIDs anymore, and what you do about how you solve that composer who's been overly remixed problem if they need to do definitive stuff. So it's discussions about that.
Yeah, I'm already on it. You even got sound examples from SoundCloud and stuff on it from Project Hubbard. So you release some stuff as a sneak peek.
I think there's a lot in the Kickstarter, so it does make sense to get some of the audience familiar with the structure and what's in it ahead of time so that they don't get too overwhelmed on day one. And it's not as if anyone's going to copy it and release their own Kickstarter in the meantime, so I think we're safe. Plus, it's
Good.
really entertaining.
Cool.
So it just people get nice feelings earlier.
And we will put links to all those sites in the podcast
Thank you.
description, so people can check them
Excellent.
out.
Well, thanks for taking the time and talking to us. It was a real pleasure.
And thanks for talking to me. And good luck, guys.
That was Chris Abbott. If you want to know more about Project Hubbard and how you can help them reach their goal, you should go to projecthubbard.com, like right now. The Kickstarter will be running through November 5th and includes stuff like the hardcover or digital edition of the book, new SIDS, a game, and there's a lot of other stuff you can pledge for, like mugs and cassettes and vinyl, and just go there right now and check it out. For the rest of us at Scene World, you know where you can find us, sceneworld.org. If you want to get in contact with me or Joerg, you can email us at podcast@sceneworld.org. Until next time, see you later.